Let's dive right in. The story of Jacob Frank is almost too wild to be true. We are talking about a man who boldly declared himself the Messiah and systematically swindled his way through 18th century Europe. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something really fascinating. We are combining two dense volumes of expert historical research, drawing directly from incredibly rare archival sources, hidden manuscripts, and forgotten court documents to reconstruct the full lifespan of one of history's most audacious religious cults. We're going from its very humble beginnings all the way to its spectacular crashing collapse. Here is our roadmap. First, the birth of a false Messiah. Second, secret rituals and beliefs. Third, conversions and imprisonment. Fourth, building a cult court. Fifth, hiding in a mortal's death. And finally, bankruptcy and cult collapse.
The sheer longevity of this deception is absolutely staggering. Archival records reveal a massive life cycle spanning almost a century, from his birth in 1726 right up to the death of his daughter and successor in 1816.
Section 1. Birth of a False Messiah.
And you really have to consider how manipulative this is. Frank used this bizarre, charismatic quote from his secret book of words to justify some incredibly scandalous early actions. He essentially told his followers that to reach spiritual purity, they literally had to wade through the mud first. For anyone questioning his methods or morality, well, he had a built-in defense. The worse he acted, the closer they supposedly were to the sweet water of salvation. It's a classic cult tactic, used to excuse breaking moral codes and to demand absolute, unquestioning submission.
Court documents and historical monographs trace an incredible early trajectory. Born in 1726 in a small village, he spent his youth traveling through the Ottoman Empire, places like Smyrna and Salonika. That's where he soaked up the mystical teachings of earlier false messiahs. By the time he returned to Poland, he wasn't just a merchant anymore. He declared himself Jacob Frank, the Messiah. He set up this communist-like community in the town of Uwani, where his followers gave up all their personal property to him. Just imagine a charismatic figure walking into your town and demanding your life savings for the promise of a new world, because that is exactly what happened here.
Section 2. Secret rituals and beliefs. So, the crucial point we need to understand is that Frank wasn't just promising spiritual salvation in some distant afterlife. He was promising literal physical immortality and luxury right here on Earth through this concept of Das. He convinced his followers that if they obeyed him completely, they would enter Das and be freed from sickness, death, and human laws entirely. Human nature really hasn't changed, has it? The desire for a shortcut to wealth, health, and a life without rules is universally appealing, and Frank figured out how to package the ultimate grifter's promise as divine revelation. And this next point brilliantly illustrates how he cemented his total authority. He took the mystical concept of a divine maiden, or Punna, and told his followers that she was physically embodied by his very own daughter, Eva. He masterfully blended complex religious mysticism directly with his own family line, ensuring that the worship of the divine was permanently tied to the worship of the Franks themselves.
Section 3. Conversions and imprisonment.
The contrast here is incredibly stark. To the outside world, the Frankists presented themselves as these devout converts to Catholicism. They even had the King of Poland act as a godfather during their mass baptisms. But the secret reality, hidden safely behind closed doors, was wildly different. They were continuing their heretical teachings, engaging in bizarre rituals, and fundamentally worshipping Jacob Frank as an incarnate deity.
Unsurprisingly, the Catholic Church eventually figured out he was running a secret heresy and had him arrested in 1760. Now, you'd think being thrown in prison would shatter a cult leader's infallible image, right? Not Frank. He used his 13 years locked up inside the Częstochowa fortress to his total advantage. It became a pilgrimage site. His followers flocked to the prison walls, and he somehow managed to turn his captivity into a bizarre royal court and harem, living like a captive sultan right under the church's nose.
Section 4. Building a cult court. 18. That is the number of people in his immediate entourage crossing into Moravia in 1773. And here is the real kicker. They were armed with official passports from 3 different empires: Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The sheer level of diplomatic manipulation required to pull that off and move across heavily guarded borders is just astounding.
Building on that momentum, he actually manipulated European nobility into letting him run a literal royal court on their lands. First in Brno, and later in Offenbach, Germany, he set up what he called a patriarchal state. He gave himself the completely fabricated title of Baron von Frank, kept his own armed guards, and lived in staggering opulence. And who do you think paid for all this? It was funded entirely by the relentless financial drain of his faithful followers back in Poland and Moravia.
Section 5. Hiding an immortal's deck.
This is where the dramatic irony really peaks. In 1791, Jacob Frank dies. He is buried with literal fake, tinsel royal crowns. But his cynical inner circle knows that the money stops flowing if the immortal Messiah is dead. So, in a bizarre 18th century weekend at Bernie's scenario, they put his body in a tightly closed carriage and literally drove it around town, telling the faithful masses, "The Lord lives." They actively paraded the illusion of a living leader to keep the grift alive.
Following this elaborate deception, his daughter Ewa steps into the power vacuum and becomes the absolute ruler of this community of souls. Interestingly enough, she claims the spiritual inheritance and definitely demands the ongoing financial tributes, but without bothering much with her father's convoluted theology. She really just wanted to maintain the luxurious royal lifestyle she'd grown completely accustomed to. Section 6. Bankruptcy and Cult Collapse.
The archival balance sheet reveals staggering financial ruin. On the asset side, you have fake royal crowns, sealed rooms full of worthless junk, and empty theological promises. On the debt side, a massive mountain of unpaid loans and ruined merchants across Frankfurt and Mainz. The big takeaway here is how a completely fabricated reality can sustain an economy of thousands of people for decades, right up until the moment it violently crashes. They were running a colossal deficit funded by nothing but blind faith.
This house of cards stood for an incredibly long time, but whenever Frank finally died in Offenbach in 1816, the illusion shattered entirely. Her death marked the total, undeniable collapse of the Frankist movement. The authorities stepped in, the creditors descended, and the loyal followers were left with absolutely nothing but immense debt, deep confusion, and a completely shattered belief system.
Which leaves us with this final, eerie thought. His skull, dug up in 1866 when the Offenbach cemetery was moved, remains the final haunting artifact of this entire saga. It's the ultimate physical contradiction of a man whose delusions of immortality reshaped 18th century Europe. How did one man's muddy theology command such absolute devotion and financial sacrifice for nearly a century?